So what this envy story really does is it creates a delay, an action delay. And this is fear's greatest weapon. I've talked about this in other content. That ultimately all the tricks that fear plays on us comes down to one key tactic. Put it off. Don't do it today. Because you got to understand, it's the best tactic. If fear can always make you think, don't act now, do it later, then for the rest of your life, it can stop you from doing something. It's like somebody promising to pay you tomorrow. They can just keep making that same promise and you never get paid, right? And this is what fear quite often does. And it quite often does this with an envy story. It'll say, yeah, you will do it, but not yet, because first you need to gain that advantage that they have. And it's often something you have to wait for. You don't just go and make it happen. You have to wait till you're this, then you can do it. You have to wait until that opportunity comes up. And not yet because, they are obviously this and you're not that yet. That's what the envy story is often doing. It's kind of simultaneously stopping you and promising you. It's stopping you from doing it now and promising you'll do it later, hinting that you'll do it later. And of course, sometimes the envy story says you'll never do it because you can't. But when you keep hitting an envy story because you really do want to move forward on this thing and it's bothering you that you don't, then it will start chucking promises in. Just wait until this happens. You'll need a bit more money before you can do that. You'll need to wait till you move to another city. That's why they're able to do it. You need to wait until you become them and then you can do it. And obviously, there's actually no clear pathway to getting to that thing that allows you to do it. It's just another kick it down the road, not today. So it either creates this image of him like not yet, or it just creates an image of impossible. It'll take an advantage the other person has or a trait they have or whatever, and it'll try to choose one that you definitely can't have or looks like you'll never have. For example, if you struggle with socializing, it says you're not tall enough. Well, you're never going to be able to grow height, are you? So it's chosen something that you can never catch up to, so give up, right? Or it might say something, you didn't come from a rich family. Well, you can't go back and come from a rich family, can you? You can't correct that. So you go, all right, I guess I'm out of the race then. So it tries to pick a certain trait that you can't do anything about. And if it can't convince you of that, it'll pick a trait that you can't have right now, but maybe later, in order to keep that sort of carrot dangling in front of you, that promise that something one day will happen, so that you don't actually do anything today. I think a lot of this is based on conditioning. Maybe you've heard this story before or seen it in real life, but the elephants in Thailand, I actually feel bad about riding them now because I know it does damage to them, but I did it once. Okay, I went to Thailand and I rode them. And I was quite struck by how docile and tame the elephants were. I mean, to see something the size of a building being bossed around by this little Thai guy, it was interesting to watch. All he had was like a stick and he controlled an elephant. And it kind of blew my mind. Like, why does the elephant put up with this? He could just chuck the guy fucking 100 meters, stomp him to death. Why is he tolerating this treatment from us? And at first I thought, oh, maybe they do it for food or whatever. But I'm like, no, elephants have no problem finding food. What is going on? Now I found out, as probably everybody else already knew, these guys grow up with these elephants. They've had these elephants since they were babies. They've been in charge of conditioning these elephants from before the elephant could even think. So what I'm seeing is a grown-up child, essentially. They view these little Thai people as their parents. And one of the things that really emphasizes this is how they can restrain an elephant by just tying them to like a twig with a piece of string. I'd expect if you're going to like restrain an elephant, you need this heavy duty chain around all four legs or something. But no, they don't need to. They'll just put a little rope around his neck, tie that rope to like a pole made out of wood, and that elephant will wait there. That elephant will starve to death there. It won't even try to escape. And it makes no sense because even if you're not an elephant expert, it's very clear the elephant has the strength to just break the string and break anything else it needs to break. I mean, you probably couldn't even hold it down with chains, but it just sits there like it's totally restrained. And I realized because once upon a time, that elephant was so small that that was an effective restraint, that it couldn't break the string or the piece of wood. And that happened long enough for the elephant to form a belief that this piece of string is stronger than me. That if I'm tied up with this piece of string, there's no point in struggling against it because I can't break it. And if nothing happens, to break that belief in the elephant's mind, it will forever be a slave to that piece of string. According to the elephant, that piece of string is like graphite steel, and there's no point, you're only going to hurt yourself struggling against it. It doesn't really understand that as it grew up, it got stronger. And I think this happens to a lot of us that eventually leads to us creating envy stories. As you'll notice that the theme of your stories, maybe it's like about wealth or about good looks or whatever, is something that you grew up with, that a lot of people told you this kind of story as you grew up, that this was the flavor of envy around you when you were a kid. For example, if you grew up in a poor family, you would have often probably heard a lot of negative stuff about rich people. And it would have been stuff around how they have an unfair advantage and so on and so forth. So you would have grown up thinking that if someone is rich, that they're probably a bad person and deceptive and unethical, and or they were like something was handed to them that you just don't have access to. And that would have started before you even had a chance to go and investigate the truth for yourself. So, especially because people who suffer with struggling to succeed in some area are often friends with and surrounded by other people who also suffer in that area. And so they just swap stories and pat each other on the back and console each other with this justification for why you all suck at something. You know, we've all got this, we've all been through this. We're all limited by our peer group culture. And sometimes, of course, this goes as far as being like national culture. You know, you get this in New Zealand, for example, with tall poppy syndrome, like the belief that it's somehow arrogant to succeed, that kind of envy belief that you wouldn't want to try and succeed because you have to be an arrogant prick who hurts other people to do it. It permeates throughout the entire culture. So you try to do well at anything, and people start giving you shit as if you've harmed somebody. So you can grow up in this like environment without even being aware that that's not the only environment available. And I can see this like in Czech Republic culture where I now live, is the way people feel about doing well financially. There's this idea of kind of like snobbery, this idea that you've done something unethical, and so on and so forth. Now, none of these poor people go out to verify if that's actually true. They don't go to find out. They just have a repulsion, and it leads them to like be sort of too modest and humble about accepting money. They'll do a lot of stuff for free when they should be paid. They'll deliberately take on jobs that their peers would approve of, but that don't pay well, and so on. So before you look at your own envy stories, have a look at your conditioning. Take a moment to think back to something that you would have thought of as normal. It would have been just the beliefs everyone seemed to have around you. But take another look with a critical eye. When you're envious of someone, do you start telling yourself a story about how they're different or advantaged or bad in some way that sounds like stories you heard when you were younger? Some common ones, money is a very common one, that if you struggled financially, you'll have often been raised around people who also struggled financially. I mean, we tend to live in class societies, don't we? So we're surrounded by sort of equal paychecks relatively. And therefore, stories about people who did better financially, what were those stories? Were they admiration, inspiration stories, or were they more like envy, hate stories? Odds are, if you're still struggling financially, it wasn't admiration, respect type stories, was it? It wasn't like you could do that too if you just learn what they did. It's more like you don't want to be like them or whatever. You can't be like them. And that's why you're still struggling now, because you keep telling yourself that story. Sometimes it comes down to physical traits, even race. You know, I have a few friends and clients that think they can't succeed because they're not white, as if being white gives you an advantage that nobody else could ever have, right? Because they were raised in that environment. White guys are bad. White guys are harmful. White guys have an advantage. You're disadvantaged. You're a minority. You know, that kind of language will give the impression that like I'm actually held back physically in some way, that there is a real limit. I don't even need to go and try and find that limit. I'm so sure it exists, there's no point in exploring. And it can be other physical traits. Like I said, quite often guys who struggle with women think that height's a really big, important factor, or penis size, or something they don't have, right? Even it can come down to sort of skill sets. Somebody's good at talking, you think you got to be like that. Again, you got to go back to childhood. You know, where did you learn this story? Sometimes it won't even be like at home, but maybe in school. Like a lot of the limiting beliefs I developed around dating and women and attraction, I developed through my peer group in high school. I was actually relatively pure prior to that, I was just an eager young boy, and once I hit puberty, I'm like, all right, let's check out this girl situation. I was untainted at that point, relatively. I still had some sort of stuff, where I've been affected by feminism and thought guys are kind of bad and sex is dirty or whatever. But once I really started struggling with women in early puberty years, I was surrounded often by guys who also did, and we started swapping stories, explaining to ourselves why the guys who did succeed with women are the ones who treated them badly, these jerks, and we didn't want to be like that, or they were tall and good looking, or they were in the cool group, or whatever. We started trying to tell ourselves stories to make sense of why other people were succeeding and we weren't. And then we started to believe the stories as facts. And it's the same stories we tell ourselves later in our 20s. And it can be location. You might be told that you have to be from a certain place or of a certain beginning position. It can be timing. People tell you that like it's luck. That's another one that I develops a lot, is that people who do well have some sort of luck or timing that's beyond their control, and you just have to wait for it to happen. It's not something that you can manufacture or initiate yourself. This kind of idea that they just got lucky. I mean, you think about sex, for example. A lot of guys back in my day, we used to refer to sex as getting lucky, sort of implying that this is something that drops out of the sky. You just got to be available and hope to catch it when it's your turn. The idea that you could actually go and create relationships with women intentionally. No, you sit and wait for them to come to you. I think that's why a lot of people buy lottery tickets. They believe the story that finances are something to do with luck, or why a lot of people would go to university thoughtlessly. Have you noticed that? I did that. A lot of people do that. They sort of in university, like, how did I get here and why am I here? I guess it's just because I got to. This underlying belief that you need an education, you need qualification, you need validation from society before you'll get paid. And that becomes part of your envy story. So somebody's doing well, you're like, oh, they got a better degree than me, or they're more qualified than me, or they're more intelligent than me. And you'll just blatantly ignore the people who are unqualified and less intelligent than you that are doing better than you. You'll have another story for them. They're unethical, they're deceitful, they got lucky. Right? You'll just ignore the facts that, you don't actually need any of these advantages. So my one was often about luck. It was often about skills. It was often about genetics. Those were the kind of envy points I often brought up in my narratives. So my big struggle when I was younger was with women and dating, attraction, that whole field. That was where like the biggest pain point in my life was, and the least success was happening. And so I had to come up with a lot of envy stories in order to get to sleep at night, because I didn't really want to admit that I'm the problem. And because if I had to admit that, I'd be lost because I didn't know what I was doing wrong. So, like all humans, I reached out to seek some other explanation that I could make my peace with, not some it's all your fault and there's nothing you can figure out explanation. So, when I saw guys who were doing well with women, I would tell myself stories about them. Sometimes the story was a negative one, like they're a jerk, they're an asshole, they're a psychopath, and they trick women into liking them, they seduce them. And that story helped because I was like, well, I don't want to be like that. So I'm actually noble for struggling with women. It shows that I'm a good guy, because only a good guy would struggle with women because he doesn't use these tricks. Right. So I tell myself a story that I'm actually, the guys I envy are actually bad people. Or I might tell myself, if I couldn't, bring myself to believe they were bad people, like one of my best friends was really good with women. I knew he wasn't a bad guy and that he didn't treat them badly or anything. I'd tell myself a different advantage story. Like he had an older brother who taught him how, right? Or he's just naturally good with words, or he's genetically good looking. And because all of these things were technically true, it was a very easy story to believe. I'm like, well, not only are those things true, I don't have those things, and that's also true. So therefore, I'm off the hook. I missed out on the lottery of what's needed to do well with women. And I'd see these same envy stories carry over when I started my business. I'd see people who looked pretty much like me doing better, generally speaking, in business. And I couldn't understand this. I'm trying my best. They're trying their best. They're getting way better results than I am. So I'd start telling myself a story that like they got their timing right? Or they were lucky enough to choose a niche that was trending, or they started with a bigger audience that I couldn't hope to, or they grew up in a family of entrepreneurs and they got lots of advice. And sometimes these will be things I completely made up without investigating. Sometimes they'll be true facts about the person. But again, it was the same type of envy story. Like they had this advantage that I didn't have. Therefore, what can I do about it? The idea that I might have just not been living by my core values, and that had I lived by my core values, I would see movement in these areas. That just never actually occurred to me because the envy story had already taken up the space explaining what was happening. There was really no room for anybody else to offer an explanation until much later in my life. So hopefully you're already thinking about your own envy stories and starting to wiggle them a little bit like, is there room for another explanation? Just because I've believed the same story I've been telling myself for many, many years, does that actually make it a legitimate story? Or am I just legitimizing it through repetition? Because to beat this, and you can beat this, to actually fucking succeed, you first have to admit that the story about the barrier is the actual barrier. The barrier is not real. The disadvantage is not what stops you. The story that the disadvantage stops you is what stops you. Okay, it's believing that story. The elephant isn't actually held back by the piece of string. He's held back by the story in his little elephant brain about how the piece of string can't be broken.